All right, well, the second half of this chapter will deal now with the topic of emotion. So we're going to start first by trying to define emotion. I have it defined here as having three components: cognition, action, and feeling. For the cognition side of things, I think this might be relatively straightforward because we're just merely talking about some awareness of the emotion itself, right? We are at some level consciously aware of when we are experiencing an emotion and what the emotion is. But of course, frequently we should also be aware of why we are experiencing the emotion. So if I'm feeling fearful, why, right? What's causing that? And so the relationship between this sort of external event that could be the cause of your emotion and the feeling of the emotion is an area where there's a little bit of competing theories. And we're going to kind of talk about that a little later in the notes here. So that feeling side, of course, is at the bottom of the list here. The limbic system generally is associated with this. So when we look at the structures of the limbic system, the cingulate gyrus, the amygdala, the hypothalamus, these areas play an important role in generating some of the what we call the affect, right? The feeling states associated with the emotion. But in the middle there, there's also various actions associated with emotions. So when we are sad, we may cry. When we are happy, we smile and laugh. If we are fearful of something, we may run away from that. If we feel aggressive towards something, we may fight something, right? So these specific kinds of actions, body reactions, are also components of the emotional state. So whether it's facial expressions or some other kind of reaction or response. Some of these are both, I have listed here voluntary and autonomic. So that means voluntary and involuntary, right? So the voluntary side of things, sometimes, of course, we have the ability to and essentially deceive in a way, right? We can display an emotion when we don't really feel it. I can smile when I'm not happy. And in a way, that expression is a voluntary choice. I can also have a good poker face. And if I'm happy, but I intentionally disguise my smile, again, that's a voluntary choice. But some of these other things that we're going to talk about, like the fight or flight response, is purely just the action of the autonomic nervous system here. So that's going to be things originating from the brainstem and the hypothalamus, and ways that we kind of just talked about in the previous half of this chapter when talking about the parasympathetic side of the autonomic response. But in this case, we may be talking about the sympathetic side of the autonomic response. Something else that's also worth talking about with emotion are why do we have emotions, right? What functional role does that play? You know, it's one thing to talk about why do we have memory, or why do we have the ability to learn? And I think it seems pretty obvious there. I think we know intuitively, we can even explain why, right? But what are emotions for? And it could be that there's a variety of different reasons for emotions. So now what I have listed here is barely scratching the surface, because it may be the case that emotions play an important role in social signaling, right? We could get into a really deep dive on the nature of the social function of emotion, right? So, for example, the fact that I can demonstrate fear, unhappiness, sadness, pain, suffering, that might elicit empathic reactions from others and elicit, therefore, caregiving behaviors from others. And so that's maybe an important part of human social groups, are that our capacity for empathy has co-evolved with our capacity for displaying emotional states. So that way, when we need the care of others, we have the emotional ability to do that. This shows up, of course, between adults in a social grouping or in a family unit, but it oftentimes shows up in child development, because children have the ability to display their emotions, and this elicits caregiving from their parents or other primary caregivers, and may play an important role in the formation of attachments between parents and children. So attachment formation is a whole other area that we could get into here for emotion. But here I want to also get into this cognitive component of emotion. A lot of times research in cognitive psychology that focuses on reasoning and decision-making tends to focus on rationality, right? And the idea is these researchers are typically pretty good at coming up with scenarios where they can define what we would call an ideal observer or an ideal decision maker, a perfectly rational agent, right? But when we put people into these situations, we find that they oftentimes fail to act totally, perfectly rationally. And then there tends to be some pushback here where the theorists are sort of somehow critical of human nature because they show that, oh, humans are just irrational because we let sometimes maybe emotions cloud our judgment. But this idea of having an emotion cloud your judgment seems to suggest that rationality is the end-all be-all of judgment and that emotion has no value when it comes to affecting our judgments, right? And that isn't strictly true. And so what we see here is that emotions and the function of an emotion might actually play an important role in helping us evaluate the consequences of our decisions, especially when it comes to maybe dealing with a moral dilemma. All right, when faced with a moral dilemma, that is, I'm faced with a very difficult decision, and that depending on how I make a decision, harm may come to somebody as a result of my choices here. And certainly, it seems natural to conclude that my ability to anticipate the harm that may come to others and to even feel empathy for the possibility of harm and therefore feel a negative and emotional state of my own as a result of causing harm to another person certainly prevents me from harming others, right? And or at least when it comes to choices where it may be unavoidable for me to cause harm to somebody, it certainly factors into my choices here, right? So that decisions that affect others have an emotional component to them, and that might in fact just be rational after all. So what we see here is that when we do moral dilemma research, and there's various ways that this has been done, we see that people, when asked to make moral choices, oftentimes show activation in areas we would expect, like the prefrontal cortex, because that's the reasoning and decision-making part of the brain. But we also see activation in the cingulate gyrus and amygdala, which would be the limbic centers of the brain. So we see emotional reactions here. Here's just a couple of examples of these kinds of moral dilemmas. As I said, there are many different ways it's done, but this is the top two, at least anyway, are referred to famously as the trolley problem. And so we see here a depiction of a person in a yellow shirt and blue pants, and they observe a runaway trolley car. So this trolley car is barreling down the tracks and it's out of control. And it's on the rails destined to wipe out these 5 people here, right? So it's going to kill these 5 people. And our actor here in the yellow shirt, despite the way it may look in the picture, is unable to call out and warn these people and get them off the tracks. But our actor does have the ability, because of where he's standing next to a switch box, to reroute the trolley to a different spur where it would kill that lone person in the green shirt. And now we ask you the mere question, what should this person do? Should they, if you were that person, would you allow the trolley to continue on its path and kill those 5 people, or would you redirect it and kill that person over on the other track? And, you know, you could adopt various views, like you could adopt a utilitarian view that says, well, clearly killing 1 person is not as bad as killing 5. So maybe we should reroute the trolley, right? Except, of course, it can be very challenging because you have to make this choice, and it is through your action and your choice that results in that person who otherwise would survive now being killed. And that, as we see, activates some emotional centers in the brain here. And, like I said, decision-making researchers might sometimes consider that to be irrational, and maybe you should make the perfectly logical choice of rerouting the trolley to kill 1 instead of 5. But nevertheless, humans are emotional in this situation. The second example is a slight variation where now your task is to push this guy in the purple shirt off the bridge. So a little bit more of a direct assault on a person in order to save our 5 people who are irresponsibly lingering on the railroad tracks. Maybe that's their problem in the first place, is don't loiter on the railroad tracks. But anyway, would you person's pushing off the bridge so that he falls on the tracks and blocks the trolley, right? The variation on the bottom, similar idea. Now that it's you have your 5 people plus our poor protagonist in the yellow shirt on a shrinking life raft in the middle of the ocean. And so as it's losing air, we may need to have to push somebody overboard to save the rest. And so should we do it or not, right? Doesn't matter whether we should or shouldn't from this perspective. We just know that it activates these emotional centers in the brain. We'll let the moral philosophers worry about what the right answer is from their various ethical perspectives. So let's get into the theories of how emotion works here. So as I said before, the relationship between the cognition and the feeling is a little bit controversial. So I'm going to present a couple of different theories here. The first is called common sense, because that's literally what it is. It's just our general everyday intuitive understanding of how most people think emotion works. And the idea here is that, as I have written it here, what happens is that I feel the emotion, and that emotion drives my cognitions and it drives my behaviors, right? So I might feel afraid, and I realize that my fear is because of maybe a bear is chasing me. So my feeling and my interpretation of that are the ultimate cause of my choice to start running away, right? So the behavior follows as the very last in these series of steps, right? You get the cognition, the emotion all occurring first, and then the body response occurs at the end of these series of events. The reason we're talking about this is that because we think that feels like common sense, that the feeling and emotion is what causes you to do a certain thing, has been challenged in the history of psychology. So we could go back 120 some years to William James and the founding of psychology, and we get the infamous James Lange theory of emotion, in which these two guys, James and Lange, both separately came up with this idea that it's really the other way around. It is the body response and the autonomic system responding first that then causes the emotion to occur last, right? So instead of my fear causing me to run away, according to the James Lange theory, it is the fact that I'm running away from the bear that causes me to fear the bear, right? So the body just does its own thing first, and then later I must somehow unconsciously think to myself, oh, what's happening here? Well, I'm running away from that bear. That must be because the bear is a threat, and I'm running away because I'm afraid of it. So therefore now I'm afraid. And at the end of all of that comes my fear, right? So in this case, being able to experience our body's emotional systems reactions, right? The action of the autonomic nervous system, specifically the sympathetic response, that has to come first, and is our ability to perceive that through this process of interoception, which we covered in the previous slide about detecting when we're hungry, for example, in the previous half of these notes. Same thing applies here, that perceiving my body's internal states causes me to feel the emotion. So just like perceiving my body's internal state might cause me to feel hungry, here perceiving my body's internal state causes me to feel fear or anger or happiness, and so on and so forth. That's one of the maybe concerns with the James Lange theory, is that means that we have to have a separate internal physiological state that I could distinguish to correspond to every single emotion that I could experience. And that turns out not to be a thing very much, because we don't have so many different physiological states, right? We just have a couple. And for most of the emotional stuff and the activation of the sympathetic nervous system, it's all pretty much the same generic arousal state. So doesn't necessarily allow us to distinguish emotions with different physiological states. There's other challenges to this. So for example, well, maybe challenges or maybe at least wrinkles. This theory would make a prediction that if for some reason you were unable to feel your body, you would not experience emotions. And that turns out not to be true, because doesn't take too much effort for us to find a person who has a spinal cord injury and who is a quadriplegic, and therefore not only cannot move, but cannot feel their body from the neck down. And because they now lack this interoception, this theory would predict that they cannot have emotions. But they can obviously have emotions, except for the fact that sometimes people who are quadriplegics have weakened emotional reactions to things, right? Their emotions are just less intense. So while they still have emotions, maybe it's the intensity that's really being modulated by our awareness of these autonomic responses. Some evidence that supports the idea a little bit more closely, though, are what are called the facial feedback studies. So these are the studies where I'm going to use my pencil here. I keep using this pencil as our prop. So what they do in these studies is they give people a task where they have them do things like rate how funny is a comic strip, right? So, if you read newspaper comics, you might realize that they're not really super funny most of the time. They're just kind of like, okay, haha, and very mild, right? And so if you were to just take a control subject and have them rate how funny a given comic strip is on a scale of 1 to 10 or something like that, or maybe we would use a 7-point Likert scale, right? Most people might pick somewhere in the middle, on a 7-point scale, they might pick a 4, right? So 5, 6, and 7 would be increasing levels of hilarity, and 3, 2, and 1 would be decreasing levels where it's just not funny at all. And so we'll just be neutral and say we're going to pick a 3 as a control subject. But what I'm going to do for my experimental manipulation is I'm going to have people smile first before I show them the comic strip and ask them to rate how funny it is. Because according to the James Lange theory, if you smile, you'll feel happier, right? And you're going to think things are funnier than they really are because you're smiling. That's the idea. But there's a twist here, because I can't just tell somebody to smile, right? Because if I say, I want you to smile for 5 minutes and then read this comic strip and tell me how funny you think it is, if you're a subject in that kind of a study, in that experiment, you're going to guess at what my manipulation is, right? What I'm trying to do. So instead, what they do is they have people bite on a pencil for 5 minutes. So I'm going to take my pencil and I'm going to bite on it here, right? Just like that. And what's going on, and I can't talk like this now, is that by biting it in between my teeth like this is the same kind of muscle posture and facial posture that's involved in smiling. It's the same kind of muscle contractions. And so you're essentially getting people to smile without telling them to smile, right? And so now after they bite on the pencil for 5 minutes, as it turns out, when you ask them to rate the hilarity of the comic strips, now instead of the 4 that our control subjects give, they might give a 5, 6, or 7, suggesting they think it's a little bit funnier than average. And as a further manipulation, what if I could convince people to frown? And again, I'm not going to ask them, I want you to frown for 5 minutes and then tell me how sad the comic strip is, right? But I'm going to have them now put the pencil in their mouth, but instead of biting it with their teeth, just hold it in their lips. So now, when you're just holding it in your lips like that, but frowning, right? It's the same thing as frowning. After they do this for 5 minutes, then they give a 3, 2, or 1 in response to the comic strip. They really don't think it's very funny at all, right? So it seems to suggest that these facial movements influence our emotional states, right? And then the emotional state influences your judgment on a task like that. So this provides a little bit of evidence, again, that these physical things kind of come first, and then the emotions are influenced by that afterwards, right? By the way, if we're talking about the autonomic nervous system and what's actually happening there. Well, let's have a look at that real quick. So this, we could have come, we had a look at this when we talked about the anatomy of the nervous system in earlier chapters, but here we've saved it for that. So the autonomic nervous system, as you recall, should be including both the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. And we see here that there are various nerves for that, right? We have cranial nerves that bring input from visual inputs, right? Certainly that's part of it. Part of it is related to the fact that we just need to see something in order to have an emotional reaction to it. But we also want to realize that there is outflow here too. So this outflow means that these systems are controlling those systems. So that means that, for example, when a person is aroused, they may show their eyes dilating, right? So the control of the pupillary response now is something that may happen with the sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system here, right? Now we have glands that can be activated here to produce hormones. We can regulate heart rate. Sympathetic nervous system increases heart rate and the parasympathetic slows it down. That was acetylcholine, if you recall before. We control respiration. So sympathetic nervous system increases respiration and the sympathetic slows it down. What about digestion? It's the other way around. In fact, that's what these little circles on the ends of these lines indicate here is inhibition, right? So the parasympathetic will inhibit and slow down heart rate, respiration, digestion. Well, I guess I'm a little backwards about that. Maybe I'm wrong, sorry. Because the parasympathetic is actually going to stimulate digestion, right? And so it's going to increase the function of the stomach and the intestines, as well as emptying the bladder and bowels and all this sort of thing. All that sort of stuff is all part of the activity of the rest and digest half of the parasympathetic nervous system. Where for the sympathetic output, on the other hand, it's the opposite. It's to excite and stimulate the cardiovascular system and to inhibit digestion. Right. What's going on in the brain for emotion? Well, amygdala is a good place to start here. So that's one of our key limbic organs, right? Organs of the limbic system in the brain. So we've talked a little bit about species-specific behaviors. So these are things that are unique to given species, but also emotions. So just as an example of that, listing down at the bottom here, monkeys seem to be instinctually afraid of snakes, right? So that's one example of a species-specific behavior. Predator-prey relationships are also species-specific behaviors, and maybe we'll keep that in the back of our mind as we go through this here. So that instinctual fear of snakes seems to be associated with the amygdala. We know from other animal research that if we stimulate the amygdala, dogs, for example, will show aggressive reactions. They will bare their teeth and growl and things like that. So it seems to be that the activation of the amygdala is maybe related to these negative emotions, fear and aggression. Of course, it also is interconnected with the hypothalamus, and through that, it triggers the production of various hormones, including possibly fight or flight hormones in the body, right? It also has connections to the prefrontal cortex. And so again, it would make sense. We would want to have information going to the prefrontal cortex because we want to have conscious awareness of what is it that's happening here? Why am I experiencing this emotion of fear or aggression? And what should I possibly do about it? Do I have to perform some kind of a response? Separate from the research on stimulating the amygdala are studies where we lesion the amygdala, right? So if we lesion the amygdala, this tends to eliminate these fear and aggression responses. And in monkeys, we see that happening. So that instinctual fear of snakes that I had mentioned, they lose that entirely. And they start playing with snakes. If you put snakes in their cage, instead of like jumping off into the corners and hiding and acting afraid, they approach them and they play with them. So we've eliminated fear by lesioning the monkey's amygdala. This is called Kluver-Bucy syndrome. But curiously, these same monkeys also exhibit hypersexuality. So that's maybe an unexpected result, right? If we think that, okay, activating the amygdala involves fear and aggression, why in the world does lesioning it result in hypersexuality? Well, there's a couple of explanations for this, but let's back up to this previous slide here. If we think about fear and aggression as being the activation of the sympathetic nervous system, and what that's doing is it's activating the fight or flight response, which means cardiovascular output needs to go up, but the digestive system is not really critical during a fight or flight response. So we want to inhibit that. And likewise, the behavior and functioning of all of the reproductive anatomy is also not really mission critical during a fight or flight response. So that gets inhibited during activation of the fight or flight response. So it makes sense possibly to think, coming back here, that in activating the amygdala will decrease sexual responsiveness. So therefore lesioning the amygdala so that it is not doing its thing, well, it might not just no longer decrease sexual responsiveness, but it might suddenly lead to a spike in the increase in sexual responsiveness. That's one explanation. But another way to think about it is what I have defined here in terms of approach avoidance behaviors, right? Why in the world are fear and aggression linked together in the first place? Well, those are both examples of avoidance behaviors, right? So if there's something that you are afraid of, you're going to avoid it, as the monkeys do when they see snakes normally, right? But what about, for example, what I said before about the dog who growls and bares its fangs when you stimulate their amygdala? Well, in dogs, that kind of a behavior, while it may be seen as aggressive in nature, it's really meant to be a threat, right? It's meant to be a fear. It's basically a way for that dog to communicate, I'm afraid of you and I want you to stay away from me. Stay back and don't come any closer, right? And that's an avoidance response. So even in dogs, that threat of growling is an avoidance response. And so it really seems to be the case here that the amygdala's job is primarily in stimulating avoidance behaviors, whether it's fear or aggression. It's about finding a way to eliminate that threat. The opposite of an avoidance response is an approach response. And a lot of behaviors, especially in animals, can be categorized as either approach and avoidance kinds of behaviors. And this is why I had mentioned predator-prey relationships earlier, because that's what this is. From the predator's perspective, the prey represents something for me to approach. From the prey's perspective, the predator represents something for me to avoid. And so we kind of have this little kind of a complementary relationship there, and that appears to heavily involve the amygdala in both species, right? So from the perspective of the predator animal, we want the amygdala to be inactive so that the predator approaches. For the prey animal, we want to stimulate the amygdala to magnify these avoidance behaviors so that this thing doesn't come and eat me. And by damaging it, we've lost the avoidance and we have now magnified the approach. Right. Let's talk some about what else is going on in the brain here. Another way to think about how to think about emotion from a functional perspective, and also maybe work in a little bit of this approach and avoidance concept as well, is to think about another way to view emotion in terms of these behavioral systems. We can subdivide things into the behavioral activation system, or BAS, versus the behavioral inhibition system, BIS. And this actually is a little bit lateralized in the brain a little bit. So we have this idea of the left hemisphere being the behavioral activation system, whereas the right hemisphere is the behavioral inhibition system. But if we think about this, behavioral activation is like an approach behavior. So there's a little bit of some positive emotional valence associated with that, right? So things that cause mild arousal, low to moderate arousal, happiness and excitement, these are all part of the behavioral activation system. Although anger can possibly be part of that. So that fighting, right? But notice, of course, that when it comes to the fight or flight response, a lot of times the default response is flight, right? It's just to get the heck out of there. And animals rarely fight back unless they're cornered, and they have to. So normally we say that we would want to activate the avoidance response, except in the case where there's no chance for them to escape. So now they got to try to fight anyway, right? Now on the behavioral inhibition side, we're looking at the right hemisphere. And one of the things that this does is that instead of activating a reaction, it activates attention. And so if you've ever seen something like, if you see like a rabbit in your backyard and you step outside and the rabbit sees you, it doesn't immediately run away necessarily. Instead, what it might do is it freezes, right? And I guess you could call this the infamous deer in the headlights response, right? Because that's kind of what this is, right? When a deer is crossing the road and it sees the car coming, it freezes because, again, it's activated this behavioral inhibition system. Oh, there's a possible threat. I'm not too sure if it's really a threat and what it is and what I should do. So in the meantime, my response is to freeze and do nothing while I further evaluate what's actually going on here. So if I increase my attention and arousal, right, now I have increased activation of the brain regions from this arousal, but I have increased attention to my surroundings so that I'm getting more information. But meanwhile, I'm inhibiting any action, right? I'm just going to freeze, right? So fear, clearly then, is that deer in the headlights effect here as well. Also discussed, and that I think maybe makes some sense of we are inhibited from approaching and taking us into an avoidance response of anything that we might find disgusting. Curious here about what happens if we have damage to some of these regions on the right temporal lobe that are involved in the behavioral inhibition system, is that we lose the ability to recognize emotions in others when the damage is localized to the right side like this. And that may seem to play some role in that kind of that attentional monitoring, right? So in part, we might think that, oh, if this, I see another person and I'm trying to evaluate, is this other person a possible threat to me? And I'm really not sure. So I'm just going to freeze and pay attention and try to evaluate what's up with this other person. This ability to try to read the emotional state of the other person involves these regions on the right side of the brain. And that can, of course, then be damaged. Continuing on with the theme of these approach and avoidance behaviors then, right? Again, this idea of the attack and escape kind of stuff here, that those are counterparts of each other in a way, right? That the anger and fear, at first it might just be fear, which is just to run away, but if there's no chance to run away, then it may have to shift over to the anger side of things to trigger the fight half of the fight or flight. You might also have heard that it's sometimes referred to as fight, flight, or freeze. So of course it would continue to make sense to fit these all under that kind of activation versus inhibition response, right? And we just have to shift our threshold between those two systems here. Again, the amygdala is playing an important role in the regulations of these here as well. Something else that's involved in these activation versus inhibition responses here is our startle response, right? So anytime you are exposed to a loud sound, right? So suddenly there's a big loud bang behind you, right? We usually are startled, but that startle response tends to look very much the same because we orient ourselves towards that. And we stop what we're doing and we turn and look, right? And that is a reflex, right? And it involves these midbrain and brainstem responses that we've talked about before, where the input from the ears goes right to the midbrain, that then triggers the movement of the neck muscles to say, oh, look, what was that sound, right? And so that's part of our behavioral inhibition in a way, right? To freeze and look and pay attention to what's going on, to evaluate what was this sound, right? And in a way, we don't even need to learn to do this, right? We're born with this. Babies show this reflex as well. But interesting here is that a lot of these signals also go to the amygdala, right? And even before they are going to some of the brainstem features, the amygdala seems to play an important role in regulating how we react to those kinds of things. We mentioned CCK in the previous notes as well. CCK helps regulate feelings of fullness, but it also is a hormone that has a complex role in the autonomic nervous system, and it actually increases the activity of the amygdala and can actually increase fear and anxiety. Now, how it manages to pull off double duty like this, that's not entirely clear, though it could be some speculation, for example, that sometimes when animals are eating, they are particularly vulnerable, like a rabbit that's out in your backyard just grazing and foraging. It becomes somewhat vulnerable. So to maybe possibly increase its reaction to its vulnerability as the intestine begins to fill with food. Not only is CCK starting to cause that sense of satiety, but it also helps to increase the likelihood that the animal is increasingly aware of its environment and will activate that avoidance response as necessary if there's something that happens to come around, right? So make sure that the animal doesn't completely become unaware of its surroundings while it's eating. We can also perhaps understand the influence of anti-anxiety drugs, seeing these effects as well, because GABA is an inhibitor neurotransmitter. One of the targets that it has in the brain is the amygdala. So anything that increases GABA will increase inhibition of the amygdala, which then in some, with double negatives here, decreases the activity of the amygdala, and therefore decreasing any of these negative emotional states like fear, and associated with that would be anxiety. So it then makes sense that we look at the drugs that are used to treat anxiety, which are generally benzodiazepines. And what they do is they mimic GABA, right? And they attach to the GABA receptors, have a high affinity to the GABA receptors, right? And therefore they serve as GABA agonists, mimicking the effect of GABA in the brain, and therefore inhibiting the amygdala and decreasing fear and anxiety. I've got a picture here just so that we can try to visualize some of these things. Hopefully we're somewhat familiar with where all of these parts of the brain are now, so that we can see over here that, in the brainstem pons area that's regulating a lot of these autonomic responses, as well as the midbrain that's receiving the input from the senses, especially for those loud sounds and the startle response, like I said. And then kind of coming down here, we might try to remember where the basal ganglia were when we covered the chapter on motor skills. But the idea is that right down at the end of where the caudate nucleus is, it's also in this general vicinity, which is where we'll also find the amygdala, right? And so we see its proximity to the brainstem there as well. Not to mention the hypothalamus and the thalamus as well, which is all playing an important role as part of the limbic system here. All right, well, that I think wraps up everything that we need to say about emotion for this particular content.